Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we are tackling a massive, age-old assumption. Can you be good without God? If the threat of hell or the promise of heaven disappears, does human morality collapse into absolute chaos? Today we are analyzing the historical roots, the logical traps, and the real-world evidence surrounding atheism, religion, and what it truly means to be a good person.
Yeah, it is arguably one of the most fundamental questions humanity has ever wrestled with.
Right.
For centuries, the prevailing narrative across, well, so many cultures has been that without a divine framework, the line between right and wrong simply dissolves.
It just vanishes.
Exactly. And we are going to impartially examine that exact assumption today, separating the anthropological history from the philosophical theory, and just looking objectively at how morality actually functions in the real world.
The mission for you, listening right now, is to discover the underlying mechanics of goodness. We are exploring whether a moral compass genuinely requires a divine creator, or if it's something entirely and, beautifully human.
It's a fascinating journey. We are looking at some philosophical and sociological arguments today that challenge deeply held beliefs on all sides of this spectrum.
And just as a quick note, as we get started on this deep dive, if you like my channel, please subscribe and hit the like button. So to really understand this, I feel like we have to start by confronting the most common objection to a secular worldview.
Yeah, absolutely. It is the idea that without God, morality is entirely baseless.
Right, the whole anything goes argument.
Exactly. The argument proposes that without a divine rule book, any moral choice is completely arbitrary. And, well, if morality is arbitrary, society has no anchor and will inevitably collapse.
It's that classic argument of, if there's no ultimate divine judge, what is stopping everyone from just acting on their worst, most selfish impulses?
Which is a fair question to ask on the surface.
It is. But diving into the historical and anthropological data, that objection immediately runs into a massive chronological problem. Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the timeline of human development. Because if we want to understand if the rules of goodness rely on a deity, we have to look at when those rules actually appeared.
Right.
Did morality arrive completely formed, wrapped in a sacred text, or was it already operating before those texts even existed?
Well, the evolutionary timeline is incredibly clear on this point. The foundational behaviors that make up what we now call human morality evolved millions of years before the first sacred texts were ever conceived.
Millions.
Millions of years, yeah.
Yeah.
Long before any formalized, organized religion existed, early hominids were already protecting their young.
Right.
They were staying fiercely loyal to their group members. They were cooperating to hunt and gather. And crucially, they were exhibiting measurable reactions to the pain of others within their community.
Thinking about this evolutionary history, I kept picturing a wolf pack.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good way to look at it.
Because if you observe a wolf pack in the wild, they don't have a holy book.
No, they don't.
They don't possess a philosophical concept of sin or divine retribution. Yet they enforce incredibly strict rules of cooperation, loyalty, and care for their young.
They have to.
Exactly. Because the reality of nature is that a lone wolf simply does not survive. It's an unforgiving world out there, and empathy, or at least, cooperative reliance, was the evolutionary glue that kept our ancestors alive, long before it was ever articulated as a religious commandment.
That evolutionary glue, the mechanics of reciprocal altruism and empathy, is precisely what drove our survival. These cooperative behaviors weren't just suddenly implanted into humanity from an external divine source at some specific point in recorded history.
They grew organically.
Right. They developed through the grueling trial and error process of natural selection. In the harsh environments of early human history, groups that worked together, that exhibited empathy, shared resources, and cared for their sick simply had a higher survival rate than fragmented groups of selfish individuals.
That makes total sense.
So empathy is, biologically speaking, the true root of morality.
So the mechanics of goodness were essentially hardwired into our biology because they were the most effective survival strategy.
Yeah.
It wasn't about being pure, it was about staying alive.
Precisely. The anthropological perspective suggests that religion didn't invent morality from scratch.
Right.
Instead, early religious frameworks likely co-opted and formalized the survival mechanisms of empathy that were already deeply ingrained in human nature.
They just put a structure around it.
Exactly. Religion gave those biological imperatives a narrative and a structure which was incredibly powerful for organizing larger and larger societies. But the biological foundation of caring for one another was laid down millions of years prior.
Which is such a fascinating way to look at history. It completely flips the assumption that morality was handed down from above, suggesting instead that it grew from the ground up.
Yeah, from the dirt up, basically.
But if history shows that empathy and cooperation came naturally first, that forces us to look at the pure logic of God-given rules. Here's where it gets really interesting.
It does.
Because if we strip away the evolutionary biology, does the philosophy of divine morality actually hold up to rigorous scrutiny?
Well, when you apply pure logic to this, you run face first into a philosophical wall that was constructed over 2 millennia ago. We have to talk about Plato's Euthyphro Dilemma.
Ah, yes, the classic trap.
Yeah, it's a question he posed roughly 2,400 years ago, and it remains one of the absolute most formidable challenges to what philosophers call divine command theory.
Which is the idea that an action's morality is dictated entirely by whether God commands it, right?
Correct. The dilemma asks a very simple yet philosophically devastating question. Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is already good?
It sounds a bit like a semantic riddle at first glance.
It does, yeah.
But when you break it down, it is a massive logical trap. Let's look at that first option. Is something good simply because God commands it?
Right. Let's play that out.
Wait, if morality is literally just whatever a deity dictates at any given moment, isn't that just a cosmic version of a parent saying, because I said so?
It absolutely is.
There's no actual inherent objective goodness there, just absolute obedience to absolute power.
What's fascinating here is how effectively that first option dismantles the concept of objective morality. If goodness is strictly determined by divine command, then morality becomes fundamentally arbitrary.
Completely arbitrary.
Think about the logical implications. If a deity were to suddenly command a society to commit unprovoked murder, then under this specific framework, murder would mathematically and philosophically have to be classified as good.
Wow.
There is no underlying moral foundation, no rational standard of harm reduction, other than raw, unquestionable authority.
Which feels entirely counterintuitive to what human beings intuitively feel in their bones about right and wrong.
Yes.
I mean, even deeply religious individuals would instinctively recoil at the idea that murder could be good just because a voice from the sky said so.
Yeah.
So that first pass makes morality completely arbitrary and meaningless. What about the second horn of the dilemma?
The idea that God commands certain things because they are already inherently good.
Right. What happens if we go down that path?
Well, if you take that second path, you avoid the trap of an arbitrary morality, sure, but you walk directly into another profound logical complication.
Huh?
If you acknowledge that God commands certain actions like honesty or compassion because those actions possess an inherent goodness, you are admitting that goodness exists entirely independently of God.
Oh, I see.
It means there is a universal standard of morality that sits outside of and perhaps even above the divine. And if goodness exists independently as its own self-sustaining concept, then logically a deity is unnecessary for morality to exist.
Man, that is an incredibly difficult logical corner to back out of.
It really is.
It forces a really uncomfortable choice. Either morality is arbitrary and reliant only on power, or goodness is independent and therefore God isn't the ultimate source of it.
Yeah.
You mathematically cannot have it both ways.
You can't. It is a profound logical knot that philosophers and theologians have debated for centuries.
But if we follow the argument presented in our analysis that leaning on a deity for the foundational logic of a moral compass is inherently precarious, it forces us to ask a very pragmatic follow-up question.
Right.
If the logical foundation of divine morality is flawed, what is actually driving the behavior of individuals operating strictly under those religious systems?
If it's not pure, logically sound goodness driving the bus, what is the actual mechanism making people behave?
Exactly. And the analysis points to something much more primal. It suggests that, in many cases, it isn't the deep-seated philosophical morality driving the behavior at all. It's fear.
The psychological dynamic here is crucial. When morality is tied to a divine command structure, it often relies heavily, sometimes almost exclusively, on the concept of ultimate consequence.
Like punishment.
Yes, we are talking about the fear of divine punishment, the anxiety of constant cosmic judgment, and the ultimate paralyzing fear of internal, infinite suffering in a concept like hell.
But that brings up a huge distinction that we have to make between compliance and genuine goodness.
Oh, absolutely.
Because fear creates compliance. It creates obedience. But it doesn't necessarily create a good person. You know, it's exactly like behaving well in a convenience store only because you noticed a security camera pointing directly at you.
That is a perfect analogy.
If you pick up a candy bar, see the blinking red light of the camera, and then put it back on the shelf, You aren't demonstrating honesty. You're just demonstrating caution.
Right.
You haven't made a moral choice. You've made a risk management calculation.
This raises an important question about the nature of character. That security camera analogy is a perfect encapsulation of the psychological critique of divine consequence. True morality, in a secular or humanistic framework, occurs exclusively when there is no audience.
When the camera's off.
Exactly. It happens when the camera is unplugged, when there is no promise of a cosmic, eternal reward and absolutely no fear of a divine punishment weighing on the scale.
It's the ultimate test of human character. Who are you and how do you treat others when you are standing completely in the dark and absolutely no one is keeping score?
Precisely. Consider the example of a secular person, an atheist, choosing to help a stranger in distress. When an atheist extends a hand, the psychological motivation is remarkably pure.
Because there's no hidden agenda.
Right. They aren't doing it to score points on a cosmic ledger to gain entry into heaven. They aren't doing it to avoid the fires of hell. They are acting simply because the other person's suffering is tangible, it is happening right in front of them, and they possess the physical or emotional capacity to alleviate that suffering.
It is a morality based entirely on unconditional compassion and human solidarity.
Yes.
And what's interesting is how religious morality, historically, can sometimes struggle with that unconditional aspect because it so heavily relies on strict categorization.
In groups and out groups.
Right. You have the believers versus the non-believers, the saved versus the damned, the pure versus the impure. When your moral framework is built on an in-group and an out-group, it can really limit the reach of that compassion.
That is the core of humanistic morality. It doesn't recognize those divisive ancient categories. It simply looks at a human being experiencing pain and responds to the reality of that pain.
It's immediate.
It is. It doesn't require a statement of faith, a specific ritual, or shared theological beliefs before offering a bandage. It is radically inclusive because the only prerequisite for compassion is shared humanity.
There is a really striking point made in the sociological analysis regarding this exact dynamic. It points out that sometimes in debates, you'll hear someone argue, well, if I didn't believe in God, I would just go out and steal.
Right, or without the threat of hell, I'd just do whatever I want to people.
Yes, and the argument highlights that when someone says that, they are actually making a terrifying admission about their own character.
They absolutely are. It is essentially an accidental confession. If the only mechanism keeping an individual from causing harm to their neighbors is the explicit threat of invisible divine retribution, they are openly admitting that they lack internal empathy. They are admitting they aren't actually a good person at their core.
Wow.
Going back to your earlier point, they are merely a monitored person. They are entirely reliant on the fear of the security camera to mimic the actions of a good person.
Which completely shifts the burden of proof in this entire debate. I mean, the traditional religious argument often asserts, without God, people are inherently bad.
Right.
But the secular philosophical argument counters with, if you fundamentally require the threat of God to be a good person, you might not actually be a good person to begin with. It's a fascinating reversal of the moral high ground.
It is a complete paradigm shift in how we view the motivations behind human behavior. But philosophy and psychology can only take us so far. It leaves us with a massive practical question. We've talked about the evolutionary history of the wolf pack, we've navigated Plato's philosophical trap, and we've analyzed the psychology of the security camera. But how does this actually play out in the real world on a macro level?
Yes. This is what I was most curious about. If true morality happens when the security camera is completely unplugged, what does a society look like when you turn off that camera on a national scale? Does it actually descend into the chaos, anarchy, and moral relativity that critics claim it will?
Well, to answer that, we have to move away from theory and look directly at the empirical sociological data. We actually have real-world laboratories for this exact scenario.
We do.
Demographers and sociologists point directly to some of the most secular countries on the planet today, nations with the absolute lowest rates of self-reported religious belief and church attendance. We're looking at places like Scandinavia, Japan, and the Netherlands.
Okay, I looked at the data from Scandinavia and Japan provided in our research. I was genuinely shocked. Yeah, because I expected at least some level of moral relativity or localized chaos without a unified religious framework to keep everyone on the same page. But the metrics show the exact opposite. Their crime rates are fundamentally lower. They have higher social trust. How is that functionally possible without a centralized divine authority.
It is entirely possible because we fundamentally misunderstand what holds a society together. The data shows that these highly secular nations consistently exhibit not just the lowest violent crime rates in the world, but incredibly high levels of what sociologists call social trust.
Meaning they trust each other.
Exactly. Trusting strangers on the street, trusting public institutions, and trusting that your neighbors will generally do the right thing, completely devoid of the threat of hellfire.
That's amazing.
Furthermore, these nations often feature much fairer income distribution, less systemic corruption, and exceptionally strong public health and education systems.
So, secularism clearly doesn't cause societal collapse. The metrics prove that societies can thrive, and perhaps even excel in their care for one another without a religious framework. So what does this all mean?
Well,
How does a society hold itself together so effectively without that divine safety net?
thinking about the mechanics of this, it sounds like removing God from the equation is a lot like taking the training wheels off a bicycle.
Oh, interesting.
It's actually much scarier because the balance is entirely on your own shoulders. If you steer into a ditch and crash, you hurt real people, and you can't just blame the manufacturer of the bike. You have to own the crash.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, your training wheels analogy captures the exact sociological mechanism at play here. When you remove a divine authority from a culture, moral responsibility doesn't vanish into thin air.
It doesn't.
It actually becomes incredibly heavy. It becomes deeply, undeniably, and exclusively personal.
Because there's no cosmic excuse to fall back on. Exactly. There is no secret, mysterious divine plan to blame when systemic poverty or injustice occurs. You cannot wave away human suffering by saying, well, it is simply God's will, when a tragedy happens due to human negligence or greed.
Right.
And perhaps most heavily, in a purely secular worldview, there is no ultimate cosmic forgiveness waiting at the end of the line to magically wipe the slate clean. If you harm someone, that harm is real. It is permanent in this world, and the responsibility to make it right is entirely yours.
The actions impact real lives, in the here and the now. You can't just kick the moral can down the road to the afterlife and assume justice will be sorted out later.
No, you can't.
You have to fix the injustice here.
That is the immense, sometimes terrifying weight of absolute personal responsibility. And what the sociological data suggests is that it is precisely this heavy weight that drives these highly secular societies to build such a robust, empathetic social system.
Oh, because they know they have to.
Because the citizens recognize that there is absolutely no divine safety net waiting to catch those who fall, they realize they have an absolute moral imperative to build a human safety net.
That makes a lot of sense.
They gladly pay higher taxes to invest heavily in universal health care, public education, and strong social welfare programs because they understand on a cultural level that this one life is all we have and it is entirely up to us to take care of each other.
They build the safety net because they know with absolute certainty that nobody else is coming to catch them. That is a wildly different, deeply empowering perspective on what motivates a whole society to be good. It's not the fear of a fiery pit keeping them in line.
Right.
It's the profound, mature realization that we are all we have.
And that profound realization is the absolute foundation of a truly mature humanistic morality. It's a morality born not of ancient commands, not of the fear of punishment, and not of the desire for eternal reward.
Right.
It is born of shared humanity, rational empathy, and the undeniable reality of our interconnected lives on this planet.
We have covered some truly massive concepts today, moving from ancient history to modern sociology. Let's do a rapid-fire recap of everything we just explored for everyone listening.
Good idea.
We started by looking at the evolutionary timeline, seeing how cooperative, moral behaviors like reciprocal altruism evolved for our survival millions of years before any sacred texts were written. Empathy was our evolutionary glue, ensuring the wolf pack survived.
From there, we examined Plato's devastating 2,400-year-old logical trap, the Euthyphro Dilemma, which mathematically demonstrates that morality cannot logically stem from divine command without becoming either entirely arbitrary, meaning anything God says is good, even murder, or proving that goodness is independent, making a deity unnecessary for morality.
We then dismantled the psychological illusion of fear as goodness, comparing religious compliance to simply behaving because a security camera is watching you in a store.
Exactly.
True morality, we saw, is the unconditional compassion of an atheist helping someone simply because their pain is real, without any hope of a cosmic reward.
And finally, we looked at the real-world evidence.
Yeah.
We saw how modern secular societies, like those in Scandinavia and Japan, do not collapse into anarchy.
Right.
Instead, they thrive under the heavy real-world weight of absolute personal responsibility, building incredibly strong public safety nets because they recognize there is no cosmic backup plan to save us from our own negligence.
It's an immense amount of philosophy to process, but it is incredibly relevant to how we navigate our daily lives and how we view our neighbors. Why does this matter to you, listening right now?
It matters a lot.
Because the very next time you are faced with a moral choice, whether it's returning a lost wallet, advocating for a vulnerable person in your community, or just how you treat a stressed-out coworker, you can pause and truly examine your own motives.
Yeah.
You can ask yourself, am I doing this for the promise of a reward? Am I doing this out of the fear of punishment? Or am I doing this simply because it is the right and empathetic thing to do for the human being standing right in front of me?
It strips away all the theological noise and leaves you with the raw, uncompromising reality of your own choices. And as we leave you today, I want to offer one final thought for you to ponder on your own, something that builds on the psychology of that security camera we discussed earlier.
Okay, let's hear it.
If true, pure morality is doing the right thing when absolutely no one is watching, how does our modern, hyper-connected, social media-driven world impact our character?
Oh, wow. That's an incredibly relevant point.
Think about it. In an era where every single good deed, every act of charity, and every social stance can be instantly filmed, posted, and immediately rewarded with a dopamine hit of likes, shares, and public praise,
Yeah.
are we in danger of losing our true morality all over again? By putting our entire lives online, have we simply dismantled a divine observer only to replace it with a digital one?
Are we just performing for a brand new camera? That is a heavy, heavy question to leave on. Keep thinking deeper, and we will see you next time.